Welcome to Blind Date with Knowledge. This is a weekly half-hour talk show featuring Queen's University researchers and scholars. The show is a platform for Queen's researchers to discuss the significance to and benefits of their research on everyday lives. I'm Barry Kaplan, the show's host. Blind Date with Knowledge is broadcast on CFRC Radio, 101.9 FM, Campus and Community, Queen's Radio in Kingston. We're located in Carruthers Hall. All the episodes of Blind Date with Knowledge are available on the CFRC website or the Queen's University research website at queensu.ca/research. In this episode, my guest is Dr. Ann McColl, who is a professor in the Queen's School of Rehabilitation Therapy in the Department of Public Health Sciences. She's the Associate Director of the Center for Health Services and Policy Research at Queen's University. Dr. McColl is also the academic lead for the Canadian Disability Policy Alliance, which is an association of academic, community, and policy partners committed to understanding and enhancing disability policy in Canada. Dr. McColl's research examines access to health services for people with disabilities, disability policy, spirituality and health, and primary care for special populations, and community integration and social support. That's quite an impressive list of services. Welcome to the show, Ann.
Thank you, Barry.
When I was reading your bio, I was particularly struck with the concept of spirituality and how that relates to health. Can you talk a little bit about that? Maybe explain to our listeners how you understand spirit in terms of our Western health system, and maybe talk a little bit too in that conversation about how the mind and the body and the spirit are connected.
That's a tall order, but I'll give it a shot. Let's start by saying what we mean by spirituality. And it's one of those things that people talk about without necessarily being terribly precise about what they mean. And part of that is because it's so difficult to define. So people just go, okay, let's not define it. Let's just go with our intuitive understanding of the concept and not get all bogged down with words, because it's quite an evasive concept. However, I think if we're going to have a meaningful conversation about it, we have to know what each other means by spirituality. And so I, fight the good fight and try to give a precise meaning. So here's what I mean when I talk about spirituality. Spirituality is a human trait that is related to the extent to which one is able to or wishes to perceive something beyond what we can experience with our five senses and with our brain. Those are the ways that we normally encounter our world. But there's this other way, this transcendent way that we call spirituality. And embedded in that is the word spirit. And we can't really talk about spirituality without confronting what we mean by spirit. So there's a number of different ways of thinking about spirit. We can put a capital S on it and think about a particular spiritual entity, a particular deity or otherworldly being that we give a name to. And different religions subscribe to different names, different configurations for that deity, but that's the most formal way to think about it. The other way is to think about it, or another way to think about it, is to think about it as something beyond human comprehension, something mysterious, awesome, but not really something that we can pin down and give a name to or have any kind of definitive human understanding of. The third way is to say, well, spirit is actually in us. Spirit exists within human beings. It's the part of us that animates our will, that makes us who we are, that defines our identity.
The animus versus the body part.
Exactly. Yes. So, depending on how you think about spirit, it will depend what you think spirituality is. and how formally you define spirituality. Anyways, getting back to your question, which was how is the spirit related to health? And in my research, I've looked mostly at how it's related to disability rather than health. There's loads of evidence in the literature to say that spirituality is positively related to health, that people who have a vital, active spiritual life are more likely to be well to start with, to resist becoming ill, and to, once ill, to do better in terms of recovery. In terms of disability, I think that people with disabilities very often have a slightly different relationship than people without disabilities with spirituality. I think the fact of having a disability brings people into a different kind of a relationship with the world and with the possibility of something beyond the world. I think the enormity of the impact of disability in people's lives calls for an explanation beyond our mundane kinds of causal, inferential explanations.
You mean like, why is God visiting this affirmity on me?
There are all kinds of questions that go along with having a disability, existential questions like, why did this happen to me? Am I being punished for something? Does this make me less human? Is my life still my own? Does it belong to me? Do I have control over it? Who's in charge of what happens and why things happen the way they do? All those questions, whether you have a disability that starts from birth, is incurred in childhood, in adulthood, in old age, all those questions confront people who live with a disability and who encounter the world differently than, say, the vast majority of people.
And while I can appreciate that that is a reality for people, for most people who have a disability, I know you can probably flip that over and say it's a gift in some way, because the capacity that I need to develop to overcome that and be in the world and be with myself and to be as human as I can be in whatever limitations I have is a very empowering and very inspiring thing. And I know some of the research that you're doing is in appreciative inquiry and disability. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. You put that very nicely, by the way, Barry. I really appreciate your understanding of it. Disability studies has evolved over the past century from kind of a charitable approach where people with disabilities were viewed as, sort of pitiful victims of their circumstances and the objects of charity, to a real change in the 80s and beyond, where people with disabilities weren't so much viewed as having something wrong with them, but as encountering a society that was not equipped to allow them to flourish and be their best selves. And that we call that the social model of disability, the idea that the determinants of disability lie outside of the person rather than in them.
Okay, that's great. Where I want to go with this appreciative inquiry, I'd like to hear more about it, because it's refreshing. It's a ray of light, I think, in some of the negativity that one hears about disability and let's have you talk a little bit more about that.
The world of disability studies has evolved into what is called critical disability studies. In other words, the interface between critical theory and disability studies. And so critical theory is all about who holds power, why things are the way they are, how the power differential affects those, particularly on the wrong side of it. And so disability studies, to a very large extent, has become critical disability studies. and it's all about disabled people as an oppressed minority. And health professionals are one of the groups in society that is viewed as one of the primary instruments of oppression. Well, I teach emerging health professionals, and while I have absolutely no argument with that perspective, it's perhaps not the best way to introduce young people to the idea of disability and what it's like to live with a disability. So I was familiar with appreciative inquiry. Appreciative inquiry, instead of looking at what's wrong with the world, tries to imagine the world at its very best, tries to find examples of where the world is functioning at an optimum level, and to say, what can we learn from that, and how can we maximize the possibility of the world being more like that. And so I thought, I wonder if it's possible to combine disability studies with appreciative inquiry, and to, rather than critiquing society, look at how much there is to appreciate in the challenges that people with disabilities face, in the resourcefulness that they marshal to encounter those challenges, in the diversity that they bring to our society, and the benefit that we all gain from that diversity. And also for my students who are going to be health professionals or social services professionals, the benefit of spending one's career learning from people with disabilities, and recognizing that the world looks differently through different lenses, and that we can grow and benefit from the people that we try to offer service to.
It's very commendable, very uplifting value. I'm glad you were able to share those points of view with our listeners.
Thank you.
I close out every episode of Blind Date with Knowledge by asking my guests to tell us a joke, recite a short poem or inspirational quotation, or reference a song related to their research or the personal motivation associated with their research. So, Mary Ann, back to you.
Okay. Well, I'm not in the habit of quoting Theodore Roosevelt, but this quote is attributed to him. No one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And what I like about that quote is that it encourages us as researchers to remember why we're doing what we do, to remember that our research has an impact on real people living with real problems in real lives. And if we don't know those people and understand the problems they encounter from their perspective, if we don't ensure that our work is accountable to them at some level, and that the problems we're researching are problems they would recognize and that they would affirm, then I think we're missing the boat. Some of the most satisfying experiences I've had in my research career have been when I've worked hand in hand with consumers, mostly people with disabilities. I've worked with a number of prominent national disability organizations, and it's been very satisfying. And most recently, we are working with the federal government to try to help them to shape Bill C-81, the Accessible Canada Act. It's very nice to see the research come full circle.
Fantastic. My guest in this episode of Blind Date with Knowledge has been Dr. Mary Ann McColl. Mary Ann is a professor in the Queen's School of Rehabilitation Therapy in the Department of Public Health Science. If you have a question about anything related to research that you would like discussed by our guests, or if you have comments about today's conversation with Mary Ann, please email me, Barry Kaplan, at bdwk@cfrc.ca. Thank you very much for tuning in. Welcome to Blind Date with Knowledge. This is a weekly half-hour talk show featuring Queen's University researchers and scholars. The show is a platform for Queen's researchers to discuss the significance to and benefits of their research on everyday lives. I'm Barry Kaplan, the show's host. Blind Date with Knowledge is broadcast on CFRC Radio, 101.9 FM, Campus and Community, Queen's Radio in Kingston, and we're in Carruthers Hall. All the episodes of Blind Date with Knowledge are available on the CFRC website or the Queen's University Research website at queensu.ca/research. In today's show, we're going to be talking with Dr. Lee Ayrton. Dr. Ayrton is an assistant professor of gender and sexuality studies in education with the Faculty of Education. Their research program explores the micropolitics of gender and sexual diversity accommodation in K-12 at teacher education, with particular emphasis on the issues facing transgender and/or non-binary people in those settings. They recently published a popular book entitled Gender, Your Guide, a gender-friendly primer on what to say, what to know, what to do in the new gender culture. As an advocate, Dr. Ayrton founded They Is My Pronoun and the No Big Deal campaign. In 2017, they received the Youth Role Model of the Year Award from the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity. Hi, Lee. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Barry. Thanks for having me.
Well, pleasure. Let's start by talking a little bit about your book. I'm going to quote from the webpage that promotes the book. The days of two genders, male-female, boy-girl, blue-pink, are over, if they ever existed at all. Gender is now a global conversation and one that's constantly evolving. More people than ever before are openly living their lives as transgender men or women, and many transgender people are coming out as neither men or women, instead living outside of the binary. Gender is changing, and this change is gaining momentum. We all want to do and say the right things in relation to gender diversity, whether a job interview, a parent-teacher night, or at a family dinner. But where to begin?
Well, there you go. Where to begin? Well, I think the reason why I wrote Gender, Your Guide, and just to be clear, it is a popular press book. It does take a lot of what we know from research literature and from my own experience of teaching about these things. It takes all of that and it packages it for somebody who really doesn't have a clue where to start. So what I noticed when I began doing public education around things like gender-neutral pronouns and the diversity under the transgender umbrella is that there weren't a lot of resources that actually gave people practical instructions, practical advice, right? So what I noticed were a lot of advocacy-based resources, like this is why transgender people should be openly welcome and accepted and included, right? Or this is why we might have to think differently about things like pronouns, but not a lot of resources that actually let you know what to do. So the book is basically a what to do, what to know, what to say. Precisely, that's what it says in the title, and I'm really excited that it's out in the world.
To me, it seems like a new frontier.
Many people feel that way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Which isn't entirely accurate, because the ways of living gender that are coming more into public life, that we usually put underneath the trans umbrella, those have actually always been with us. So there have always been ways of living gender that are outside of the girl-woman box on one hand and the boy-man box on the other hand. But because through many different reasons they've been kind of suppressed and pushed underground, many people have the impression that this is a newfangled thing, when in fact it's just the reemergence of something very old.
What do you think is causing that that momentum?
Well, I think there's a bunch of things. First of all, transgender people have been pushing back against different social systems and different kinds of infrastructure and ways of accessing what we need to have our needs met, have been pushing back against that for many, many years. First, because it didn't society and government struggled to acknowledge and recognize that trans people exist, and then later struggling against a system that required us to show up in only two particular ways: as women who were born and assigned male, or as men who were born and assigned female. And with all these sort of very strict conceptions of what that looks like. So there was a lot of regulation of transgender people. You had to have particular different kinds of medical interventions in order to be able to change your identification, whether or not those medical interventions were things that you personally needed and required. So there's sort of a long history of trans activism, first pushing to have any kind of recognition, and then pushing against the idea that any kind of medical or governmental system gets to say who we are and what we need to do.
What would you say is the top one or two issues that are of concern to this community now? You hear about the unisex bathrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Is that one of the issues that is of concern, or are you're obviously focused on vocabulary? Jump in here.
Sure. I think that because of what's happening now is a general growth and awareness that thinking about transgender people and living transgender life in public and the things that we need, because there's a general growth and awareness that it isn't as simple as, oh, well, you can actually just access the women's bathroom now, or, oh, well, now you can just use the men's. There's a more and more growth in people's understanding that it isn't as simple as that. I think that's really interesting and really promising, and why I say that my book is a book for this time and place, because the way that transgender people are emerging into public life kind of defeats pretty simple ideas of what gender is and what gender means. So the top of mind issues for many of us, particularly on the non-binary end of the transgender spectrum, so in neither one of those binary boxes, what's top of mind for us is realizing that if we have to advocate for our access to different kinds of services, we're doing it in a bit of a different way than trans people who are women or who are men. So institutions like Queen's itself, like schools, like school boards, like businesses and workplaces are realizing that what they have to do with their facilities, with their ways of organizing their labor force, for example, have to be a little bit different than just admitting some people into this category that doesn't have to change. So it's an exciting time, because what's required in order to accommodate people on the non-binary end of the spectrum are some institutional changes that actually benefit a lot of people. Like, there are many people who, for many different reasons, don't have their needs met by sort of narrow-stalled, binary-gendered washrooms, right? So the provision of more accessible bathrooms hopefully will be something that comes into play. Many institutions like Queen's have a policy that if there's a significant renovation or new build, they must have a particular number of accessible all-gender bathrooms built, which is wonderful. We just had two new ones added to my building, MacArthur College, on the second and third floors, which is wonderful. And that works for all kinds of people. So, I think what's top of mind is looking at deeper kinds of changes that need to take place and finding ways to follow through on those.
It sounds like the concepts are being defined and explored, but at the same time, change is happening, and we want to embrace and encourage our communities to embrace some of these concepts. Mm-hmm. Let's turn the conversation to school a little bit. Your current research explores how K-12 schools are responding to the inclusion of gender identity and gender expression protections in human rights legislation, including implications for teacher education. Mm-hmm. Talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the province of Ontario, and in fact in every province and territory, because education is a provincial or territorial responsibility and area of jurisdiction. So in every single province or territory in Canada, every single citizen or person residing there has protection from discrimination on these two grounds: gender identity, which is one's internal sense of oneself as a man, woman, both or neither, and gender expression, which is what I say to my students is kind of like the flag that we put up. We run up our flagpole every day when we leave our house.
Gender expression.
Our grooming, our hair, our removal or augmentation of facial hair, our clothing, etc. And there's many other elements too. So everyone has these two protections. And I am very interested in exploring how in media, but also in the very policy documents that are guiding K-12 schools' implementation of this response to this law, I'm interested in how these protections are being delimited to only people who are transgender. And that is actually not how they are written in the text of the Ontario Human Rights Code. So we have all kinds of interesting situations with tribunal decisions where people are being denied access to gender expression protections because they are not transgender. when if a transgender person had brought that same kind of complaint, they may well have been granted access to those protections.
Right.
So there are a lot of misconceptions floating around, including in relation to the tribunal itself, about what these protections actually are. So I'm very interested with my colleague Kyle Kirkup at the University of Ottawa at looking at how school boards not only understand what these things are, so we can see what's out there, see how they're being implemented, and then offer maybe some different kinds of guidance. And Kyle's a lawyer and a law professor, so that's where he comes in there. So we're looking not only at how they understand it, but also at how school boards are helping to construct the meaning societally of gender expression. We just don't have enough case law at this point to say what it is, so institutions are kind of stepping into that void.
Is there a place currently where this kind of discussion can fit into existing curriculum, or is this going to have to require sort of more structural adjustment to accommodate this kind of a class or discussion?
Right. Well, it's interesting you brought up the term curriculum, because we aren't actually policy documents that we're looking at don't really touch the curriculum. Okay. So the content of what is being taught and learned in schools, which is not only about the documents the province produces, but also how teachers are engaging their students with that content in class. So we actually don't see a lot of references to curriculum in the policy documents, which is interesting. Occasionally there are some suggested guidelines for teachers of how they could teach in a way that is sort of gender expansive or more broadly gender inclusive, but overwhelmingly what we're finding is any reference to gender identity or gender expression is contained in policies that touch exceptional situations. Things like discipline, suspension, expulsion, and also transition.
Interesting. For
students who are transitioning. When what I hear and what we know in the literature is that teachers long for practical offerings from folks like me about what they can actually do to produce the kind of environment we're talking about, where GI and GE discrimination are less prevalent. So what we're learning from teachers, and what I hear all the time, is tell us what we can actually put into practice, including via our curriculum, including in our classrooms, when a lot of these policy documents only provide these exceptional sort of situational event-based procedures. So that's something we're going to be sharing with the world in the spring.
Lots of room for growth. It's a growth industry.
It is. It's a good time for this stuff.
Usually at the end of the show, I try to bring out some of the personality of the researcher by asking them to tell a joke or a story or a poem, something like that.
So you asked me to think about that, Barry, and actually I couldn't think about a joke or a poem or a quote or a song that inspires my research. I actually thought about a term that a lot of us throw around, which is me-search, which is kind of a joke. So it means that the research that I do in some way relates to things that I experience or I face myself. So my research is very much motivated by many, many years of participation and belonging in queer and transgender community. So noting what I and my fellow trans people experience as we move about in the world. So one of the things that I have learned that really drives my research and why I focus on micropolitics, or sort of interaction, nitty-gritty ways of welcoming gender diversity,